Wrestling is often a small world. After all, it historically has been a place where, as a result of kayfabe, you had to know someone in order to get your start in the industry. And even as the years have gone on and kayfabe has fallen away, it's remained something of a family business. Of course, this can lead to some surprising situations where performers you wouldn't expect to be related turn out to be just that. But what are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive in Family Affair, wrestlers you didn't know were related. And if we're going to start anywhere, let's do so with one of the top stars in all of WWE right now, and the man you wouldn't necessarily know is his uncle. Who are we talking about here? Why, Cody Rhodes and Tugboat. Yes, as the brother-in-law to the legendary American Dream Dusty Rhodes, Fred Ockman is actually the maternal uncle of Cody. And that makes him the uncle to Dustin too, as it happens. Sure, this may never have been acknowledged on screen at any point, either in WWE or AEW, but whenever a big family get-together takes place in the Runnels household, you can be sure he'll be there. But who is Fred Ottman, we hear some of you ask? I can sort of remember Tugboat, and even Typhoon. That said, his name rings a bell for some other reason. Well, if you feel this way, you wouldn't be wrong, because in the modern day, he's probably best remembered for being the man behind the infamous Shockmaster. That's right, the most memorable for all the wrong reasons gimmick ever created was helmed by someone who probably looked after both Cody and Dustin as babies. Hell, some of the former's earliest memories of watching wrestling on TV outside of his father likely involved seeing Tugboat in WWF during the late 80s and early 90s. So perhaps it's little surprise that both he and his brother were eventually inspired to lace up their own boots too. We just hope Uncle Fred didn't teach them how to walk around gracefully and not trip over himself. And we also hope he didn't give them any character advice when it came to getting a new gimmick over. But even if he had, he wouldn't be the only person in the extended Rhodes family who was already working in the wrestling business and trying to help them along, because elsewhere, the two grandsons of a plumber had another uncle in Jerry Sags. Of course, Jerry Sags should be better known to audiences as one half of the Nasty Boys, a top tag team act during the golden era WWF. But while his on-screen persona may have been that of a villainous punk, off-screen it appears things were far different for Uncle Jerry, as he was often taking these duties seriously by helping out both Cody and Dustin whenever he could. And it appears at least some of what he said must have rubbed off on them then, because at various points in their career, the Rhodes sons were able to become a star duo in their own right. So successful were they, in fact, that in October of 2013 at WWE's Battleground pay-per-view, they had one of the greatest tag team bouts of their era when they squared off against and beat The Shield. Was any advice Jerry Sags gave them responsible for this? It's hard to say, but it certainly wouldn't have hurt. After all, during his day, Sags was able to become not only a one-time WWF Tag Team Champion, but also a three-time WCW Tag Team Champion, a two-time AWA Southern Tag Team Champion, and a five-time FCW Tag Team Champion as well. So we guess it's just as well Dusty had such a large extended family back in the day then, as it allowed his sons the chance to get all sorts of feedback from different people with various roles within the industry. But then, perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise the American Dream had two brothers-in-law who were also wrestlers, as with the business being such an insular one during the territory days, people tended to date within their circle. And if that meant starting relationships with the sisters of your coworkers then, well, so be it. Hell, it's exactly what happened with the other nasty boy, Brian Knobbs, when he ended up getting married to the sister of Greg Valentine's wife. Obviously then, this makes the two brothers-in-law as well, and it also shines a whole new light on their various battles against each other when the Hammer was working as part of a tag team with the Honky Tonk Man during the early 90s. Why is that? Well, knowing each other as well as they did, they likely had a greater trust than normal, and so this allowed them to go that extra mile in risking their bodies for the entertainment of fans. Don't get us wrong, we're not suggesting the kind of matches the Nasty Boys and Rhythm and Blues were putting on back then were comparable to the high-risk stuff Kenny Omega and Will Ospreay are giving us today, but as we've seen time and time again, anything which takes place in the ring can lead to injury. So for them to be able to talk things out at the dinner table during family gatherings ahead of time, well, it must have made it a lot easier to enact these plans once the time came for the bell to ring. And if someone accidentally got a little banged up, things could always be sorted out quicker than usual on account of them being related. After all, as the saying in wrestling goes, it's the ones you love you hit the hardest because you know they're going to be okay with it. But what of the other half of Rhythm and Blues, the Honky Tonk Man? Sure, he may not have had any relation to the Nasty Boys, but as a Tennessee native who came up during the time of the legendary Continental Wrestling Association in Memphis, he was able to get his foot in the door there on account of him being the first cousin of Jerry Lawler. Of course, you shouldn't need us to tell you who Jerry Lawler is. After all, he's one of the most famous wrestlers of his era. Yes, back in the 70s and 80s, there were few people outside of Elvis Presley himself who were better known to his hometown populace. And that was because, as the undisputed top star of the Memphis territory, Lawler was basically a superhero to every fan who came to watch him. So using this star power then, he was able to get his cousin, a young Wayne Ferris, his first opportunity when he moved to the city and began teaming with Larry Latham as one half of the Blonde Bombers in 1978. How would this work out for the pair? Pretty well as it happened, because after they took part in the now iconic Tupelo concession stand brawl against Lawler and Bill Dundee in 1979, they were made men. And this helped Ferris to eventually score a job with WWF in 1986, where he then morphed into the Honky Tonk Man. Unfortunately though, it appears by that point all was not well with him and his cousin, as the two had gone through something of a falling out over money. So while Honky was having a record-setting Intercontinental title run over in New York, the King was back in Memphis remaining estranged from him. And when Lawler himself went to WWF in 1992, his kin would not be there to greet him, as he'd already be gone. But it wasn't as if there weren't other family members on the roster coexisting at this point, as over in the Intercontinental title scene, Bret Hart was in the midst of a feud with his second cousin, Rowdy Roddy Piper. That's right, believe it or not, but the Hitman and the Rowdy one are actually family, a fact which likely made it a lot easier for them to have a classic together at WrestleMania 8 that year. Hell, it's probably the main reason Piper was so willing to put Bret over clean, as if we know one thing about the kayfabe Scotsman, it's that he didn't do jobs very often during his run in New York. When it came to the Hart family though, he always had a soft spot, as it was the patriarch of their clan, Stu, who helped him get one of his early breaks in the industry. So because of that, if Bret or any of the other sons of his mentor ever needed help getting over in the future, Roddy was always willing to do whatever it took. In fact, so deep was their relationship, when the Hitman had his stroke in 2002, Piper was the lone wrestler to actually visit him in the hospital, showing you just how much he cared for him and his family. That said, for as heartwarming as this is, the real connection the two shared above all else was their time in the ring together. And that's because when it came down to it, during an era when in-ring work was never less valued in WWF, Bret Hart and Roddy Piper were able to create something which stood out to such a degree it's still being talked about today. Sometimes though, relatives in the wrestling industry don't get the chance to work together directly. And this is a particular shame in the case of Matt Bentley, as his cousin is none other than Shawn Michaels. But then to be fair, it's not as if the two ever had much opportunity to intermingle on TV, because after being trained at HBK's Texas Wrestling Academy during the early 2000s, Bentley spent a couple of years trying and failing to secure a job with the likes of WWE and Ring of Honor. It wasn't until he started performing with TNA in 2003, in fact, that something more stable arose for him. But with Shawn Michaels being back in New York at this point, and the two companies having no crossover, it meant there was little hope the two family members would ever get to share the ring together. That said, maybe this was for the best because, for as great as the Heartbreak Kid is, he might not even have been good enough to get a 5-star classic out of Matt Bentley. Not that Matt was terrible, of course, he just wasn't anything standout. Yes, while he may have looked forward to getting to go one-on-one with his more famous cousin eventually, especially as he regularly borrowed his moves and mannerisms during his own matches, it was less likely fans would have been excited about the whole thing. Nah, they'd probably have tuned out even if they were aware of the familial situation between the pair, as in the mid-2000s, it was all about seeing Michaels have dream bouts against the likes of Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle. Still, even if he was left to do his own thing, Bentley managed to carve out a nice career for himself down in Nashville anyway, as there, he'd become a 2-time X Division champion, with him continuing to remain a featured player all the way up until he left the company in 2007, and in large part, retired from the ring. But we've talked a lot about cousins today, so let's move on to a different family dynamic for a while, as it's not all about extended family when it comes to relatives in the wrestling industry. No, on some occasions, it's a surprising father-son combination which arises, such as the case with Terry Gordy and his offspring, Jesse. Yes, everyone knows Dusty Rhodes is the father of Cody and Dustin, just as we're all too aware Ric Flair is the dad of Charlotte. But what might not be as immediately apparent to most fans is the fact that Terry Gordy, one-third of the legendary Fabulous Freebirds, is actually a direct blood relative of Jesse. Who was Jesse, though? Well, for those watching SmackDown during that hellscape, which was the late 2000s, they might remember a very odd tag team made up of a seemingly feral big guy named Festus, and what appeared to be his handler/best friend, a figure that called himself Jesse. Sure, it may not have been a great gimmick or even a particularly long-lasting one, but at least it gave the Tennessee native some TV time and a chance to show what he could do to a larger audience. What most watching him back then probably wouldn't have realized, though, was that Jesse came from a very proud lineage of in-ring performers, as back during the territory days, there were few more feared people in the business than Terry Gordy. But then, why would there be? After all, aside from his role as one-third of the Fabulous Freebirds, Gordy was also a well-established singles star, enough to where on 2 separate occasions in the early 90s, he held All Japan Pro Wrestling's Triple Crown Heavyweight Championship. Sadly though, his son would never be able to reach those heights, as once he left WWE in 2010, he'd pretty much retire from the ring altogether. But at least he got to be there for his father's Hall of Fame induction in 2016, so it wasn't like it was all bad. Hell, it could have been a case of not only never getting to work with your family on screen, but also never really getting to interact with them off screen either, which was exactly what happened between Mike Awesome and Hulk Hogan. Wait, what? The Hulkster and that 70s guy are related? Well, technically, because Awesome is actually the cousin of Michael Bolea, better known to most wrestling fans as Horace Hogan, and with Horace being the shoot nephew of the former WWF champion, then it means there is a legitimate, albeit tenuous, connection there. That said, we're not even sure if Hogan is aware he has another relative in the industry, as we've never heard him talk about this one publicly. But then, given how many lies he'd tell regularly, would we believe him if he did? After all, he was the original bass player for Metallica, if you didn't already know. And even if he and the ECW star did have some kind of bond in their personal lives, it's not as if he ever helped Awesome at any point, as during his run in Philly in the mid-90s, he made himself a star all on his lonesome. Well, he did have a little help from Masato Tanaka and some brutal chair shots to the head, we suppose, but aside from that, it was the Tampa native forging his own path. Then, when he finally did make it to WCW in 2000, his association with Terry Bollea didn't really do much to raise his stock there either, as he'd been given a series of embarrassingly bad gimmicks by Vince Russo. In fact, if we didn't know any better, we'd swear Russo and Hogan's blow-up at Bash of the Beach that year actually served as a mark against Awesome, and possibly even led to him effectively getting buried thereafter. So sometimes maybe it doesn't pay to have a more famous relative looking out for you in your career then, as under the right circumstances, this could actually backfire. That said, one person such a thing certainly hasn't backfired for is Zelena Vega, as with the help of her cousin Amazing Red, she was able to get her foot in the door of TNA in 2011 and impress the right people in the process. Yes, before she was in WWE, the Trinidad actually got her initial break down in Nashville while working under the name of Rosita. And a large part of the reason she got the opportunity to do this at all was because, by this point, her cousin was already a big deal there. That's right, in the 2000s indie scene there were few people more respected than Amazing Red. And given this is an era which also saw the development of the likes of Bryan Danielson, CM Punk, Samoa Joe, and El Generico, that's saying a lot. But why was the Puerto Rican performer so beloved by those in the know at all? Well, whether it be as part of the International Wrestling Association in his home country, Ring of Honor, or yes, even TNA, Red always provided a show-stealing performance, win or lose. In fact, it was his work in the ring which partially inspired his cousin to eventually lace up a pair of boots for herself, as come 2010, she was preparing for her own in-ring debut. Obviously though, while Amazing Red never made it to the bright lights of WWE like so many of his peers, Thea would get there in 2017 when she signed on the dotted line with NXT and was at this point rebranded Zelena Vega, business manager of Andrade Cien Almas. And since that point, she's gone on to even bigger success as a main roster mainstay and a member of the LWO. Hell, in 2023, she even got to go back to her spiritual home country of Puerto Rico and perform for her people, something her cousin was no doubt very proud of. That said, it's not like the former 3-time X Division champion hasn't been continuing to do great work of his own. No, aside from creating his own promotion called House of Glory, he's also done the odd excursion over to Japan to face off against the likes of Will Ospreay. Will the fact a close family member now works in New York be able to get him a foot in the door in the future? Anything's possible, especially with Triple H having more creative control than ever. Hell, we wouldn't even rule out seeing the family member of another iconic Latino star somewhere down the line. Who are we talking about this time? Why, none other than the son-in-law of the late great Eddie Guerrero, Aiden English. Of course, with Eddie no longer being here, it's not like he can put in a good word for Aiden anymore. Hell, it's unclear if the former vaudevillain ever even got to meet Latino Heat in person, as by the time he started dating Shaul Guerrero in the early 2010s, his future father-in-law had already passed. Still, that didn't mean he wasn't a big fan of the former WWE champion growing up, so much so that when he first met his future wife when they were learning the ropes together in the Performance Center, it must have been an intimidating prospect for him to ask her out. But ask her out he did, and from there the two fell in love right around the same time as his career was going through something of a boom in New York. Why was that? Well, this was the period where he first made it to the NXT roster as part of a retro throwback duo alongside Simon Gotch. Sure, his career would never reach much higher than this, outside of a brief period where he served as the Herald of Rusev, and Aiden English certainly never became the star Eddie Guerrero was. But that clearly didn't matter to Shaul, and it clearly didn't matter to her mother Vicky either, as to this day, the Chicago native remains a welcome addition at family gatherings. Would Latino Heat have taken to him the same way? Probably, as the two would have no doubt bonded over their time in the ring. But we guess we'll never know the answer to that question for sure, just as we'll probably never know the answer to the question of whether or not it's possible to have a more bizarre wrestling family tree than the one which includes Bryan Danielson, John Laurinaitis, Road Warrior Animal, and the Bella Twins. Quite a combination, isn't it? Really, it feels like the crossover episode between four sitcoms which were never even a part of the same era. But how are all these parties connected at all? Well, let's go through them one by one and find out. As most people are probably aware by this point, Bryan Danielson is married to Brie Bella and has been since 2014. And of course, with Brie's twin sister being Nikki, this makes her and the American Dragon in-laws too. But what some might not be aware of is the fact that the Bella's mother, Kathy Colas, actually married Johnny Ace a year later in September 2015, making him part of the family as well. Yes, it's easy to imagine Danielson and Laurinaitis sitting down over a vegan dinner discussing the intricacies of pro wrestling. And even though Laurinaitis may have never been on the level of a Danielson in terms of in-ring skill, he certainly knew how to carry himself at one point during his days in Japan. And so did his brother too, because he's not the only Laurinaitis to hit the ring and have success, as he shared a mother and father with Road Warrior Animal himself. That's right, Road Warrior Animal, real name Joe Laurinaitis, is actually the sibling of Johnny Ace, and this makes him a part of the extended family of both Bryan Danielson and the Bellas too then. Of course, while we'd pay good money to see this group of seemingly disparate personalities in a ring together at some point, that's never going to happen now, as Animal sadly passed in 2020. Still, if we play our cards right, we could see a multi-person tag between the American Dragon, his stepfather-in-law, and the Garcia twins over on an episode of Dynamite before all is said and done. Who knows? Given how weird wrestling has been during the last couple of years, we wouldn't even be surprised to see Johnny Ace join the Blackpool Combat Club. But even if they never get a chance to share the screen together, they'll always have their personal time to be around one another, just as everyone else we've discussed today will too. And that's because, at the end of the day, no matter how close you are to your colleagues in the ring, family will always come first.